Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Way with Maps. I'm your host, Maps, aka Javier, and today we're doing the long-awaited episode 2 of the Puerto Rico statehood versus independence debate, but also all the rabbit holes that we go down. So, Marcelo's back. Marcelo, say hello.
Hi.
And today we also have Alvaro joining us. He's also from Puerto Rico. I guess you can introduce yourself and kind of give some background on like where you're from and I guess like your Notre Dame story. I don't know.
No problem. Perfect. So, hello. My name is Alvaro Carrillo. As he said, I'm a Puerto Rican native. I was born in Puerto Rico in Bayamon. And now I'm studying here in Notre Dame. I'm a sophomore at the moment, and I study accounting and political science. Yeah.
Okay, cool stuff. Before we start like the show, so Alvaro's doing, I guess he'll go on to explain, but he's doing like, I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard probably about like the earthquakes that have been going on in Puerto Rico. And before that, obviously the hurricane. So Puerto Rico was kind of in a recovery stage, and then we got hit by these earthquakes, and a lot of people were affected. And so I guess, Alvaro, you can explain kind of what you're doing to help those people out.
Yeah, so this whole situation has been very surprising and emotional and very serious in reality. So basically, right now, we've started class today in Notre Dame. So we just got off a winter break. And in this winter break, all of us were in Puerto Rico. And in the Three Kings Day, which is a very popular festive holiday in Puerto Rico, which here in the United States, they don't celebrate, but it's a cultural thing. And in the morning of Three Kings Day, we felt a very strong earthquake around 6.4 in the Richter scale. And I live in the north, and I felt the earthquake. My house shaked and everything, but it lasted for a few seconds. It was nothing very serious. But in reality, the earthquake was very close to the southern part of the island. So that means that the people who live in the southern part of the island felt the earthquake way stronger, and it had like the consequences were way different in the north and the south. I'll explain myself. So in the south, being that they felt the earthquake way stronger, a lot of schools completely fell, and that's an issue we could later talk about the code, the regulations and how they were building schools. They were not following protocol. The schools were not built to be safe to withhold 6.5 earthquake. So some schools completely fell. A lot of people lost their homes. So this is a very serious issue that happened in Puerto Rico. The international community has recognized this issue, this event that happened in Puerto Rico, but it doesn't have the attention it needs in international media. And we as Puerto Ricans have a calling and a need for a country a responsibility is the word, for a country to do something. So now that we come here down in the States, being a Puerto Rican, I felt the need to do something. I had to do something for my island. So what we're doing now through the Puerto Rican Student Association, we have here in Notre Dame. I was able to found it this year with a friend of mine, Adolfo Serbia. And the first thing we're going to do is start fundraising money, because we need to do something for the island. It's time. It's our responsibility. And even though right now we're here with air conditioning, like safe circumstances, we sleep with a roof and we feel nice right now. That doesn't mean that every Puerto Rican has that same luxury. A lot of people right now in Puerto Rico are sleeping in the streets
under tents.
They're waiting for FEMA to be approved to FEMA funding. To respond. They have responded, but very lightly, because primarily due to the reason that there's $18 billion in a FEMA reserve for emergency funds for Puerto Rico, but Donald Trump has not yet approved those, even though a lot of Democratic legislators are putting pressure on Trump to sign the relief aid funds to go to Puerto Rico. So right now, a lot of people are sleeping literally in the streets, because the very serious issue is that we did feel one strong earthquake, and then followed by some other strong earthquakes surpassing 6.0 in the Richter scale. But the interesting thing is that the Puerto Ricans are feeling a lot of replicas, like aftershocks. That's the word. Aftershocks of 5.0, 5.1, 5.2. Even though they're not sufficiently strong to destroy buildings, they still shake houses. You still feel the ground shaking.
And also the people are still scared. And
Exactly.
that's probably the most important part, because even if their house is still intact, they sleep outside out of fear.
Yeah.
And that's it's impressive.
Yeah, because a lot of replicas are being felt. So aftershocks are being felt. So even though the 6.4 earthquake already passed, there's still a lot of more earthquakes in a way smaller scale. But people are really scared. Like literally, there's people that they don't feel safe sleeping in their houses. So you have people that still have their houses intact, and like it's some people lost some stuff, but their house is still standing and they can sleep inside. But they prefer to sleep outside under a tent than sleep in their house due to the fear of if they're sleeping and the ground starts shaking. And even though right now it's like 5 point something, the aftershocks, you never know if you get a 6.5 aftershock randomly and your house falls. So it's very serious right now in Puerto Rico. And as a Puerto Rican, I have the need to raise money, and all of us are going to start moving soon to start helping our island in whatever way we can. So if I can explain a bit of how we're going to fundraise the money.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we're planning on opening a GoFundMe account. The Puerto Rican Student Association here in Notre Dame will be working with that. And we're also partnering with other Puerto Rican student associations and other universities. Right now, we're partnering with an American university and one in Johns Hopkins too. We're still, I'm sure, on other schools will keep getting in once we get in contact with them. But the main platform will be a GoFundMe. And right now, we're thinking of some of the nonprofits we're gonna give the money. One of them is Casa Pueblo, which is probably, you guys know, it's a very popular nonprofit in Puerto Rico. They work a lot for humanitarian issues and environmental issues. So we're gonna be giving them a bit of money. We're also looking into a organization called Instituto de Nuevas Escuelas, which is it's basically an institute of new schools. They're a conglomerate of public schools in Puerto Rico, which offer public education, but they also are doing initiatives in education outside of their schools. And right now, being that the earthquakes passed, they're organizing events to hand out products like for like aid and food and basic things so people like deodorant and other things that people need which are living outside. So it's very interesting. Right now, those are the two main organizations we're going to be giving money, but we're still searching for other organizations which are doing a very good job in with the money they're getting and how they're helping people. So yeah, that's what we're planning on doing.
Yeah. So by the time this video comes up on YouTube, I'll probably this will probably be a little bit more established, and I'll be able to put probably like a link. You can send me a link, and I'll put it in the description, so you guys can go there and donate. The scary thing about this is, like, for example, we all know about the hurricane that struck. You can prep for a hurricane, and you know when it's coming and relatively how long it's going to last. And obviously, it's a lot of devastation and destruction as well. But the scary part about the earthquakes is you never know when it's going to come. And especially a lot of experts are saying that so Puerto Rico is like basically in between two faults. One of them is the southern fault, which is the one that's mainly going off. But the northern fault is right on the Puerto Rican trench, which I believe is the second deepest trench in the world after the Mariana Trench. And a scary reality could be if the southern fault goes off strong enough to where it activates the northern fault could give off much stronger earthquakes that could be potentially like super devastating. And that a lot of people predict that it's going to keep like earthquakes in Puerto Rico are going to keep happening until we have like a big one and the tectonic plates kind of fall into place. Hopefully that's not the case and they just move a little bit and fall into place naturally and we don't have like one of those big ones. But that's just the scary part. That's the reality that a lot of people are living in right now. And I guess this kind of translates perfectly into what we're going to be talking about today, I guess, kind of like the whole statehood versus independence debate. How I guess this is also like one of the problems, which is pretty recent. The first hurricane struck in 2017, and now in 2020 we're having these earthquakes. So Puerto Rico's been going through like a recent kind of natural disaster phase, and we are very dependent on the United States because our government is does not have any resources at all, which goes back to the debt crisis, amongst other things, right? We also had like a big scandal this year, which we spoke about in the last episode. I highly suggest that you guys listen to that last episode that I had with Marcelo first. We kind of like laid the groundwork for what we're going to be talking about here. But yeah, I guess that right now we're pretty, and Puerto Ricans are pretty dependent on the U.S. government. We've seen a lot of videos too on social media about like traffic jams of people trying, just like regular citizens trying to get into these affected communities to bring resources because we can't depend on the government. So a lot of people depend really on these kind of
Samaritans.
Yeah, just good. Yeah, it's like, imagine that, like depending on your neighbor to like make sure that you have food for the night. It's insane. And I feel like that's something that a lot of, particularly like our like continental listeners, can't really, like, it's probably shocking to them because of the fact that like normally, for example, when Harvey struck Texas or Hurricane Katrina,
Sandy,
and all these
Katrina,
other natural disasters,
any of them.
you can usually depend on your state to fund some like
or federal level too.
Aid, and then federal level.
And also there's immediate results, like the reparations are made in a week or two or three. Doesn't go past that. But in Puerto Rico, I'd say it's a lack of organization, especially with the like we spoke in the last episode, the amount of changes that are going on in the government structure in itself is just too much for it to handle right now.
I think one of the biggest factors is a lack of confidence by the federal government to Puerto Rico. And from the citizens, the Puerto Ricans, to its own government. For example, right now, one of the biggest issues, as I was saying before, is that some of the schools in Puerto Rico are not built to withstand 6.5 earthquakes. And that's a problem because there was a code. But these schools were built without following those codes. So there's definitely some shady reasons for why that happened.
Largely probably due to political corruption.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yep. Like, for example, there's an example I gave to a friend of mine. He was asking, it's like the government, if you're building a public school, the government gives you, I'm going to give a hypothetical number, but the government gives you $100,000 to build a school. Obviously, it's more, but just a hypothetical number. And the contractor that's doing the school, he gets the $100K, and instead of investing the $100K in materials, in top quality materials to build a good school that follows all the protocols, he decides to use $70,000 or $60,000 to build the school, and the other $40,000 or $30,000 he keeps it for himself. And that's what's happening a lot in Puerto Rico. And now that's raising a lot of questions. People are literally asking, okay, what engineer approved this school? What engineer built this school? What engineer approved this school?
And why didn't the federal government, why didn't the state government, regulate it and check on it?
And how did it go under everyone's nose until it collapsed?
Until now,
And that school, the school that fell, I don't know where it was, but it was trending on Twitter. Everybody, you guys had this.
If you heard
that school was approved like a week before the earthquake happened. That's how crazy it is.
If you guys if you guys have heard or seen the news about the earthquake, you've definitely seen this school, because it's like the main one. It was like a 3-story school, and the bottom story is basically gone because the 2 stories, the second and the third floor, collapsed on top of it. And thank God this happened during the nighttime where nobody was in that school. But if one of these earthquakes, a lot of schools right now are scared to start classes. I mean, they're doing it slowly but surely, but they're scared because it's a massive responsibility to have all these kids, like these students, in a school in which you don't know if it could collapse during the day.
And just buildings in general, because it's not only schools; it's also got into a higher education point. Like, for example, the UPR, the system of universities in Puerto Rico, they've delayed classes. They have yet to start classes because they're checking the buildings. Some of them are built on non-firm ground. There's one in the town of Mayagüez that the building is sinking, and this has been a problem since before the earthquake. But it's just things that get overlooked. It's
Right.
It's crazy.
So I think it's interesting what you said about like lack of trust from the federal government to the Puerto Rican government, and also lack of trust from the citizens to our own government.
Well, yes.
But like I kind of want to go down that route a little bit. I feel like a lot of that is mostly due to the fact that, like, for one, I think Puerto Rico is like in dire need of just new political parties, because we've been back and forth with the same political parties, and we spoke about this in the last episode a lot. But basically, we've been just going back and forth in between mainly the same political parties, and we've just been seeing no results for, I want to say, 50, 60, 70 years. And I feel like we just need new, innovative political parties that aren't the problem with politics in Puerto Rico too. I feel like it's just a lot about self-interest. And I feel like people just need to, we need to focus mostly just on fixing the issues and not, I guess, which is kind of redundant because I want to talk a little bit too about like statehood versus independence, but almost a solid point to be made as well is that we have a lot of issues that we have to solve even before we answer that question. I feel like, I feel like mostly on that, we just need to, I don't know if like the Puerto Rican government, regardless of like the political party, can recover and can bounce back from that, because it's just been so many years.
I think it's to be able to have a change, you need to change the culture.
Right.
Because in Puerto Rico, there's when you're voting, when you're in the voting ballot and you're voting for a candidate, in Puerto Rico, there's 3 major parties. Now other parties are surging, but since its foundation, there's been 2 major political parties. It's the PPD, which is Partido Popular Democrático, is the Democratic Party, and their belief is having a connection to the United States, but Puerto Rico still is in a certain way sovereign. It's a Commonwealth, and then the New Progressive Party, which is it advocates for statehood.
Right.
And these 2 parties have dominated politics in Puerto Rico, and they have been corrupt year by year. Like right now, I think you already it talked about this, where Puerto Rico has around $72 billion in public debt, and these 2 parties are the only 2 parties that have ever been in office. So the main responsibility for this debt
are these 2 parties.
Two parties, and it's crazy that they're still on power, and some parties have challenged these parties, but they've never been a serious threat. And the only like big difference we've had in politics in Puerto Rico is like last election, there was 2 main candidates, Lugaro and Sidre, which were independent candidates,
right? And
they challenged these 2 parties, and they did a dent, not a big dent, but for example, Lugaro won 11.13%,
right?
And that's a decent amount in Puerto Rico,
especially in Puerto Rico, that a lot of the voting population are older people.
Yeah,
and these older people, when they vote, they tend to vote based on the trust that they've gained with their party, with their preferred party. And to see that an independent candidate is getting 11%, it's impressive.
Right.
It's impressive.
Right. Recently, we've been seeing, especially with everything that happened with, which we also talked about, our governor, that had like a big scandal because, like a big corruption scandal, that we talked about that in the last episode. But we've been seeing kind of this almost like a movement to try and like saying that like, oh, Puerto Rico's like we're awake and we're like ready to change things. I'm really curious to see these coming elections how willing and how true that is for for our population as a whole. What do you think?
There's not going to be a change.
Right. That's what I think too.
There's not going to be a change. It's absurd that this summer, literally, they had to clean house. The New Progressive Party. It was charged with a lot of corruption. The government resigned, and you would imagine that this party's like, okay, this happened, they're dead. You know, like they're out of the political scene.
Yeah, you'd imagine.
Right now,
they're still in the race.
Their candidate is leading the polls.
Right.
The New Progressive Party is leading the polls in the election, and they just got off a huge
scandal,
corruption. Like the first, in the history of Puerto Rico, was the first governor resigned
Yeah,
in less than a year,
That's
they're leading the
debatably
polls.
biggest government scandal.
I mean, they're leading the polls.
and it gained an international recognition that, unlike any other moment, the only moment that
it was insane.
got as close to it was in the year 2000 with the Vieques protests.
Right.
But
Rosselló went to Congress, and
exactly, but that was 20 years ago.
Yep.
his father. Interesting.
Yeah,
It was his father
crazy.
who went to Congress to fight
yeah.
for that.
But I will say though, who is the candidate? Pierluisi.
Yes.
Right now,
Right.
Well, right now it's Pierluisi was the main candidate, but Wanda Vázquez, she was the Secretary of Justice of Puerto Rico.
Right.
When Ricardo Rosselló resigns in summer, the Secretary of State was the second in line to become governor, but the Secretary of State resigned.
Mm-hmm.
So in succession, the Secretary of Justice goes third in line. So she's governor now.
Yep.
And Pierluisi declares he's going to run for governor, and now she declares she's going to challenge him in the election. So now we have two main new progressive candidates, which are going to have a primary.
I feel like probably Pierluisi's gonna win it because of the fact that he's like running through the same political party, but he was not in our ex-governor's I guess cabinet. Number one. Number two, I feel like he's a good candidate. It should be known that he was running up against our ex-governor during the last elections, and I thought he was going to win because it felt natural. He had the most political experience. He's he just basically seemed to just be the guy, and he didn't win. I feel like that's a lot due to just fanaticism over, like you mentioned, our ex-governor's father was also governor at one point.
Oh yeah,
and kind of people just stay in that mentality of, I guess, like voting for the same lines of people.
People loved his father so much because he's considered one of the best governors in the history of Puerto Rico, which is Pedro Rosselló, which he studied in Notre Dame. Interesting to say, he studied undergrad in Notre Dame.
True.
But yeah,
An alumni.
and he's an alumni of here.
Fun fact.
And yeah, fun fact. And some people consider him as one of the best governors. Other people consider him really bad. But to understand how people love him, some people love him that much, they call him the Messiah. And people started calling his son the son of the Messiah. It was like a joke.
Yeah.
But in radio stations, they called him, the son of the Messiah is running for governor. He's going to win. Like, that's how much people loved him. And that was a big factor. He ended up, even though he was not the best candidate, he ended up winning.
Right.
And now you see the repercussions. He had to resign due to corruption and lack of experience, lack of knowledge.
I feel like actually the fact that he was so loved was that made his, like, when all this corruption scandal when it arose, it hit the population so hard.
Right.
I feel like because it's a candidate that people trust, and even after all these blatant lies that he was saying and just everything that made him have to resign, there are still people who continue to be his fans, and they say that he should still be in office.
Yeah, but that's that whole fanaticism thing, man.
Yeah,
and
it's a big problem,
like you mentioned, his father was seen as kind of like one of the greatest, like one of the best governors Puerto Rico has had. Like you said, that's kind of up for debate too, because a lot of people would say the opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
In my opinion, I think that all governors of Puerto Rico haven't been great. I think they've been mediocre at best because of the situation we're in. If we had a good one, then we would have gotten some progress. But we've been going downhill ever since Puerto Rico got its first Puerto Rican governor. So like, what is that? So that again goes back down to the trust. But I feel like it's funny because a lot of people blame the government, but it's a democracy. So the people vote in the government. So it's not that Puerto Ricans don't trust the government. It's that Puerto Ricans don't trust themselves.
Yeah.
So then what's the solution here? And that's kind of like one of my big points for statehood. I don't think that we should get the US to be crazily involved, because that'll probably bring severe repercussions, especially in recent years. People would probably not be happy if we went, for example, if we reinstated an American governor in Puerto Rico.
No.
That would be bad. We can all agree on that.
But
I feel like we definitely need to work closer to the United States government, because I feel like we depend a lot on them, number one, And number two, we need to let them know that we as a people are trustworthy and that we are like, because this is the whole thing of like, I mean, like, why did Puerto Rico have an American governor in the first place? We go to the invasion, of course, and the military government that was there at the time, and then America, like the U.S., was fairly colonial for a long time being. But that also comes down to probably the trust worthiness, or that the United States government gave the Puerto Rican people to choose their own government. We talked a lot last episode about how there were nationalist uprisings in Puerto Rico that were severely censored by the United States at a point in history, and so basically you create this setting in which, okay, Puerto Rico finally has its own voice, and it can, like, Puerto Ricans can choose their own governor, and we have control over our own government. But what ends up happening is we are responsible as a people collectively for the downfall of our, like, island in a way, because that's just the way, like, that's just the way it is. So ultimately, I feel like we just need, like, swift change. But sadly, like you mentioned, and I agree with you, I don't think that we're going to see that much change in the coming years, sadly, because that's kind of what we need. We need, like, new political parties that are interested in solving the issues that we have already, largely due with, like, the debt. There's a lot of, like, disadvantages that Puerto Rico has too that I feel like we should be negotiating with the United States, especially when it comes to trade and things like that.
The Jones Act, like, there's a lot of policies that had established by the United States that have hindered the development of Puerto Rico. For example, right now with the Jones Act, if nobody, like, this is a bit of, I don't know if you guys already talked about this, La Ley de Cabotaje. Have you talked about it?
I believe we
mentioned it, but you could go ahead again.
So it's like that really hinders Puerto Rico's economic development, because let's say there's an order of, I don't know, from cars from Japan, and they're delivered to Puerto Rico. Like any normal country, they'll be delivered straight to Puerto Rico, then taken to manufacturers, like local companies or foreign companies, whatever's working on Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico, we can't do that.
Right.
If any international deliveries have to go to a U.S. port, so they got to go to the United States.
Right.
Then from the United States, they need to be changed to another fleet that has a majority of U.S. citizens, like, operating the crew. Mm-hmm. And from there, it goes to Puerto Rico. Right. So that's just, in logic, that's an increase. Right. That's extra expenses.
And I feel like Japan, for example, kind of makes sense because it goes through California and then from Florida to Puerto Rico, I guess. But, like, let's say, for example, and this I think goes for humanitarian aid as well. If let's say that for some reason, like, Brazil wants to send in a shipment of, I don't know, like whatever, like aid, like humanitarian aid supplies to us, it has to go, I believe, to Florida first, and then they ship it here instead of going straight to Puerto Rico, where it's
crazy.
Needed. Yeah,
it's extra expenses. That raises all the prices.
Right. There are, I do know that there is a side of the argument that exists that talks a lot about how some people depend on that kind of U.S. exclusive thing, though. Like, for example, a lot of shipping companies that exist in Puerto Rico. So I do know there's, like, two sides to the argument. I'm not too, like, well versed in the other side of the argument, but I do know that, again, that's just another thing that's very debatable, depending on who you ask.
I feel like for the situation Puerto Rico is in as an island, we're very reliant on imports. And I feel like
definitely
if any person has Puerto Rico's prosperity and it's in their interest, they should recognize that even if, let's say, I own a shipping company or something, and I know I would be living better off with the Jones Act, I feel like you should still self-evaluate your position and recognize that you shouldn't be voting for representatives who are doing things in your favor exclusively.
Right.
If what you want is growth in the island as a whole.
Rightfully. It comes down to, like, the short term versus the long term. And we need to start thinking about the long term, because for 60, 70 years, people have only been thinking about the short term. And we're living the long term of what was once the the short term for them.
The unplanned long term is what we're in now.
People in the 60s, 50s that voted in for short term solutions, now in 2020, we're living these like consequences. And
what the government of Puerto Rico has been doing for years is putting a Band-Aid over a Band-Aid over a Band-Aid over a Band-Aid. And that's what's happening. Like, when governors started taking, when the debt skyrocketed, when it started growing at an absurd rate, was when the 936, which the 930, have you guys explained what's the 930?
Go ahead, you can explain.
So 936 is a law that was passed in Puerto Rico, which basically gave foreign companies, multinational companies, huge tax exemptions, like absurd. Like they had to pay like 4% tax. And if they came to Puerto Rico, they established operations in Puerto Rico and they paid a local tax. But the tax was so low, companies were like, they loved it. And big pharmaceutical companies started coming to Puerto Rico and started generating a lot of money. But when the governor, Luis Aferré, which was a new progressive party, he was a governor of the new progressive party. When he was governor, especially Reagan was pushing a lot in Puerto Rico to take that law out because a lot of companies were literally just moving to Puerto Rico.
No, they were taking advantage.
They were paying like almost no taxes.
And even still, even with these little amount of taxes, there were also companies that were even still avoiding the taxes.
Yeah, but they were like, even though they were paying very few dollars in taxes, they were generating jobs
and
they were moving the economy. They were like, people always think like, oh my God, they're paying 4%. That's so bad. But you think about the benefits they're bringing to the island, and our economy was growing. It literally was growing. You see a graph. Once the 936 is taken out, and Luis Aferré being affiliated to the New Progressive Party, he thought that by taking that law out, it made us closer to becoming a state because we're equal to other states. Because no other state in the United States had those types of laws. Like Puerto Rico right now it was a tax haven, and we still have some tax laws that apply for that. But so Reagan was forced. It was putting pressure to take that out. Once Luis Aferré saying, "Okay, I support statehood. I think this is a step to statehood to make us equal to other states," he takes that law out, and Puerto Rico goes completely down. The economy starts going, just dips down, crashes. What do governors need to do? They need to keep the government moving. They need to keep welfare programs moving. And what they start doing, they start taking debt to cover those expenses. And once Luis Aferré goes out of office, another governor comes in. What's the governor after Aferré is? He's
Rafael Hernández Colón.
Yeah, Rafael Hernández Colón comes in.
Which is from another party as well.
Yeah, he's from the party I said before, PPD, the Democratic Popular Party. And he starts taking a lot of debt, and all other governors start doing that to offset the economic decline in Puerto Rico. And it's
not only that, it's also difficult because the momentum that Luis Aferré gained by what he did is also it's also stumped by having to vote in another governor from another party immediately after, because the governor that followed Luis Aferré was from the rival party. So it was almost as if after these 4 years of things finally getting into motion, you go back to square one. But now you have a debt that's growing at an increasing rate. And yeah, it's just a rabbit hole. That it was a rabbit hole, and it led us to where we are now.
Right.
Yeah, and it created a dependency in the United States on federal funding, being that the island was not generating that much money to keep all the programs moving. They had to keep getting debt, and apart from that, they had the need to rely more on federal funding, and that's, I'd say, is one of the biggest problems Puerto Rico has. Like, a lot of the health industry in Puerto Rico is absurdly reliant in federal funding, like 60%. And once you take that federal funding out, if your whole healthcare system falls down, your health system, your hospitals, it's a whole humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
And
well, that's what's happening now.
Yeah, exactly. And it creates that big dependency, and that's why people advocate for statehood, because they say, okay, right now it's not feasible for Puerto Rico to independendize because we don't have enough self-sufficient industries.
Yeah, we're not self-sustainable.
Exactly, so self-sustainable. So we need to rely on federal funding. And so people say, okay, if we increase that connection with the United States, if we become a state, we are entitled to receive more funding.
It's not just that. It's also that, for example, Puerto Rico has a lot of specific policies that only apply to it. I think I mentioned this in the last episode, but for example, Puerto Rico can't file for Chapter 9 bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So we're kind of stuck in this.
It's like low-key unconstitutional, but...
It's crazy. It's insane. Yeah, well, I mean,
it's definitely
the only reason it doesn't apply to us is because we're not a state. Yeah. So if we were a state, for example, we could file, and then we're fully under the Constitution. Yeah. But Puerto Rico right now has its own constitution that was written up in a way that we, for example, one of the policies that we have is that we can't apply for Chapter 9 bankruptcy. Like we can't file for it. And so we're stuck in a loop. If, for example, New York goes into like a state of crisis, the government will bail it out.
But, like Detroit. Detroit declared bankruptcy in 2013.
Yeah. So one of the things I feel like is a solution to that is we need to help the United States understand that we are like our well-being and our economic and political stability and well-being is in their best interest. I feel like that's one of the biggest flaws we have, like, or one of the biggest like marks that we miss nowadays is because, especially, I mean, coming here, you've been here for 2 years. Marcelo and I have only been here for a couple months.
Yeah.
Right. So essentially, like the way, like when I talk about this with friends and people here, it's not something that people know. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to make this episode, the past one. And like I mentioned, there's so much to talk about this. So who knows? Maybe in the future we'll have another one. But it's just like a lot of information that does not get to most people here. And the sad part is that only people here can make a difference there. Mm-hmm. I feel like, because we, for example, like this is another thing I mentioned, have no voting power in Congress. We have a representative that goes there. Pierluisi, the candidate that's running for office this year, he used to be our resident commissioner, which is our representative in Congress, but we have no voting power. We can't make decisions. We can only say whatever we say, and then other senators will obviously
take it into account if they want.
Yeah, but also they're going to prioritize their own state.
Exactly. And you can't blame them. You can't blame them.
Exactly. It's basic politics. We don't have a vote. What does that mean? When you're in the political scene, political power is crucial.
Right, of course.
To be able to do something. And we don't have political power. Like, literally, why would think about it in a political way. Why will a senator help us if we can't give them anything back?
Yeah.
Literally, if let's say a senator helps us push a bill, in politics, like, you help me push this bill, right, I'll help you push your bill through a vote.
Right.
But Puerto Rican representatives, like, can you help me please push this bill for Puerto Rico?
And
you're like, what can you give me back? And Puerto Rico's like, yeah, we can't give you nothing.
Anything.
And that's what makes it so hard for us to do stuff in Congress.
Right, but also, if you think about it as well, who votes, let's say, a representative from Texas, who votes for him? Texan citizens, not people in Puerto Rico.
Yeah. Exactly.
So obviously, he's going to appeal to his own.
Exactly.
Like, that's just normal.
There is literally no reason other than ethics for these politicians to help us. And it's the truth. Because that's the situation that we've been put in.
So, go ahead.
I'm going to give you like an example.
Yeah.
A few months ago, I was in Capitol Hill lobbying for a bill, and I went with something called the Hispanic Federation, which is mainly Puerto Rican, and we're trying to pass a bill on Congress that will deal with the structuring of the debt. It will create an audit board to audit the debt.
Right. That's one of the big keys. Yeah, auditing. Yeah. Because where did all this money go? Most of the debt
is illegal.
Yeah.
It's unconstitutional. Like, and it's proven, but it has to be audited in a formal way, and we're trying to advocate for that. But that bill is pretty radical, and the only people who are supporting it for now are presidential candidates that won the Puerto Rican vote, that want that Puerto Rican vote. For example, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. They already co-signed because it's a Senate bill.
Okay.
And once we got to Capitol Hill, we started meeting with representatives. Literally, all they do is like, "Oh, really? Okay." We tell them the needs we have. Okay. They just write it on a notebook. They just hear us out. Once we stop talking, like, "Thank you, have a good day." We leave the office. That's it. They don't do anything. And that's what happens. That's happening to Puerto Rico. But now things are changing because the reality is that a lot of people are moving from Puerto Rico. And that means that a lot of people move from Puerto Rico to the United States.
Yeah.
So this diaspora is growing in the United States. And this is causing representatives to be forced to listen to Puerto Ricans. For example, the representatives and senators of Florida, they can't ignore Puerto Rican rights, like Puerto Rican interests. They can't ignore them now. That's why Jennifer Gonzalez, which is the commissioner right now of Puerto Rico in Congress, she brought the mayor of Florida. What's his name? I forgot his name, but he came here to Puerto Rico to start like help to be taking pictures with Puerto Ricans. Like he's interested in all that stuff, and that's basically because he knows he has to connect with Puerto Ricans because they're gonna vote for him.
It's kind of ironic because you have these big states that have a lot of voting, like in the electoral Congress, like New York, Texas, Illinois because of Chicago, and Florida. And it's almost like Puerto Rico is becoming like worst, like our voter. We have almost a voter base here now, which is like we should have a voting base there, but like and when I say that I mean like for president. But it's crazy because so many Puerto Ricans have moved out. It's like we have our small group, and like you said, like in some places, so many Puerto Ricans have moved in that you just can't ignore that that part of the population. So it's insane in that matter.
Yeah. Let me correct myself. So it's Rick Scott. He's a former governor of Florida. Right now he's a senator since 2019. So, and this guy, he knows he has Puerto Ricans have a big way on voting right now in Florida, especially. So he's like, that's why he came here to Puerto Rico, and that's visible evidence of the power Puerto Ricans are having right now in the States. So as that keeps growing, and Puerto Ricans, the diaspora starts focusing less on the East Coast and Florida, then they start moving upstate. I don't know. They start going to the Midwest. Like the Midwest has like almost no Puerto Ricans, but you start moving to the Midwest, you start moving to the West Coast, and if this trend keeps happening, senators and representatives are going to be obligated to advocate for Puerto Ricans and push in Congress because they do have voting power.
Right.
They do have. We don't have them, but those senators and those representatives, by having the obligation to respond to their constituents, will start doing something for Puerto Rico. But we still got to wait for that. Because right now the diaspora is almost double the size of the population in Puerto Rico. We have like 3.1 right now, and I think it's like 6 million.
Our population
5.8 million.
Our population keeps decreasing. Like in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, but it keeps increasing in the States.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
But yeah, so essentially I feel like solution, we're talking work closer together with the US government, help them understand that we're in their best interest, and a healthy Puerto Rico means a healthy United States. I say this, of course, coming from a statehood perspective. But ultimately, I feel like if we do that, and then we need like new options and people in Puerto Rico just need to start thinking about the long term. Naturally, it's understandable because a lot of these people are desperate in Puerto Rico because they're in tight financial spots. And now with the disasters, it's like there's so much uncertainty. But I feel like we need to focus as a people and kind of just rally together like we have done. It's crazy because you see like these protests that like block entire highways, and we're doing the people are doing all these like kind of, the voice is out there. But I want to see, and this is like I would love to see like an actual change in policy, in government, something that actually means something. Because, yeah, you can protest all you want, but at the end of the day, we're not the ones making the decisions. The people we vote for are. And that's kind of the important part, not only in Puerto Rico, but in the United States as well. I kind of want to go into hypotheticals, too, just because it's fun. And I was writing this paper about I did this last semester for my writing and rhetoric class, about the potential, like whether or not it would a Caribbean Union would be feasible in like an economic, in like a European Union type of way. So
what are your friends like with what?
So
what
for example, so we were talking about this last show, like the last episode we talked about this, where countries in Latin America, originally, a lot of them wanted to go independent together. Like,
well, there was a big movement.
right. But
A lot of South America
right.
started independing.
Yeah. But for example, like I'll give a few examples. Like
What do
Puerto
you-
Rico and Cuba at one point wanted to go independent as one country. Panama, Colombia, and Venezuela at one point were one country. And like so on and so and like for example, it had a lot to do also with like regional like powers. For example, like so those were all like ex-Spanish colonies, but then you have ex-British colonies such as Jamaica and some of the smaller islands that also were looking at doing some of these things. So my whole like theory was question was would an economic or political union amongst like some of these countries, and the ones I used in particular were Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Panama, would it be feasible? And I've noticed that Cuba in particular gets a lot of backlash from the United States naturally because of the Cold War setting. But I feel like, I mean, the only reason I used those three countries was because, again, Cuba and Puerto Rico at one point wanted to leave together, and Panama is also like a country that has dealt a lot with like U.S. Involvement because the U.S. got in there when they were doing the Panama Canal and they were stationed in the whole shebang. But I feel like, I mean, it doesn't have to be these three countries, but how do you guys, like, I mean, this is all hypothetical here. It's kind of like just a fun proposition. How do you guys think, how do you guys think the population would respond if, let's say, Puerto Rico and Panama, and like let's not say Cuba because obviously there's a lot of like tension there between Cuba and the United States, but let's say like, I don't know, maybe like even like the Dominican Republic.
Well, when you're saying a union, you use this reference to European Union.
Right.
You're talking about a unifying monetary coin.
I'm
for
saying
example, as the euro.
Well, I'm saying yeah. Okay, fair question. I'm saying like, so I don't think the United States. So okay, let me just say the conclusion of what my project was. So evidently, I ended up like giving all these reasons of why these three countries would be good candidates for the union, but ultimately, the United States would never let that happen because it'd be like a threat militarily and economically, and that's obviously not what we want either. But I feel like even just like, for example, like small things with trade, like you mentioned La Ley de Cabotaje, if we could get direct shipments from Panama, for example. And obviously each country would remain independent. I'm thinking more of like an economic set of tools. And I feel like, I mean, there's a lot of more research that was going to go into this. And I'm thinking actually about doing my senior thesis on this. I mean, it's a long ways away, but like it's just something that has really caught my interest because, like you mentioned, you're a poli-sci major too, right? So I mean, I don't know if you share this view. You probably do though, where it's like I have a lot of questions about like Puerto Rico and why it's not working, and then I look at the neighbors and they're also not working. So is there something that we can do, or like is there just an idea that I just feel like for one, it's fun because it's an interesting concept, but for another, it's like I feel like like I mentioned, ultimately we all want the same thing. It's just what's best for Puerto Rico, and it'd be cool if like the Caribbean, because I feel like the Caribbean is a region that has had so much potential, and we got obliterated by colonial powers and got like a lot of our resources were taken from us. But even still, our major obstruction is political instability within our own governments, you know? Like Venezuela, if it wouldn't be going through what it's going through, it has like enormous oil deposits.
No, there's a lot of factors going into a union.
Right.
Not always it's good. It can result in economic benefit. For example, like in Europe, it did have for a long time very good results after the world wars, and it really had a really good result in economic development in Europe.
Right.
But it's not always economically like long-term feasible. For example, right now, UK wants to get out, and that's a big reason because it limits its development potential.
Yeah.
And the UK literally just wants out to be able to establish their own regulations. And tying that's the problem with a lot of unions. Unions require a lot of regulation, and a lot of when it comes to regulation, like trade and who they can trade, and that's a big factor. The idea is interesting.
Yeah.
definitely interesting, but it's a very complicated thing because
Yeah, I agree.
first of all, Puerto Rico it's not sovereign, so Puerto Rico can be.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't think it's
yeah.
right now. I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, that's what I said. It's definitely not feasible. Like that was the conclusion of my entire thing. And frankly, like I've been giving it more thought, and it's not really like, it's definitely not something that is possible whatsoever right now. Especially because, and I mean, this is interesting. I don't know if you've studied like American foreign policy. I haven't yet, but it's a very interesting thing to me because I feel like it's funny how any region doing even remotely well, like better off than they currently are, is a threat to the U.S. Like if the Caribbean gained like economic might, that's a threat to the U.S. If Europe, all of a sudden, the European Union says, yeah, like we want to establish our own military within Europe, that's a threat, which is crazy almost because. Like
right now, because the United States is a regional hegemon,
yeah, of course,
as well as internationally,
yeah,
and to be able to be a hegemon is like nobody can compete with you. Right now, the closest one is China and maybe Russia, but they're pretty far away. So the United States, under its economic interest, it wants to be a regional hegemon, which means all America, they want to control it. And you're completely right. They have intervened in numerous economies under the name of democratization and, for example,
not even economies, just political scenes in general.
Have you seen?
And they it's also been like repeatedly masked. Like they do certain things that I was reading this article. It was that explaining how every time, or the majority of times, the United States intervenes in other countries' political scenes, it's during like important days in the U.S. So like July 4, the 24th, the 25th of Christmas, like of December. And it's always like these days that media attention would be low because people are busy. It's just a fact.
Well, there's definitely that process. Do you guys know about Operación Condor?
No.
You do? So that's basically, there was there was this big communist movement in South America.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Argentina, Chile. The United States intervened and completely took down
I know
political parties. Like, for example, the time of Pinochet in Chile, Videla in Argentina. Those were military-backed regimes by the United States.
Yeah.
And these people were killing people under the name of eradicating communism. And they were like crazy.
Yeah. I guess the defense for that is if the United States would have not done it, the Soviet Union would have. But I also think that...
Soviet Union was pro-communism, though.
No, I mean, like, if the United States would have not intervened in those governments, the Soviet Union would have intervened so that communist governments would have taken over. Okay. And ultimately, that's just a lose-lose situation. But I feel like even if it was like a lose-lose situation, and let's say that the United States had to do that to like I mentioned, if it wasn't one, it would be the other. Then I feel like you also have to kind of acknowledge your responsibility in at least like helping those countries get back on their feet after now that all that stuff is over. Because I mean, this is one of the things we were talking about last episode too, is that that the United States is a very different country today than what it was during the Cold War, especially because nowadays we think of the United States as kind of like the moral center and the like pinnacle of democracy. But during the Cold War, like you mentioned, there were a lot of like government interventions and all this stuff going on. And I guess there's a lot of talk about like where is U.S. foreign policy going from here on out. But I will say that at least like now, the U.S. did what it did because it had to, or for safety, or for whatever it was. I feel like that's a part of it, but attached to that is you also have to take responsibility for what you did, and kind of, I feel like even like Europe and the US should invest in the region as a whole, especially in, for example, the United States should definitely invest in Puerto Rico because, and not only Puerto Rico, but again, there's untold stories of that we because we don't live there, we're Puerto Rican, so we can tell you like what we think in our side of the story. But there's untold stories right now of the U.S. Virgin Islands, which are going through similar things. Guam, American Samoa, they're not even U.S. citizens. So there's like all this kind of unknown stories and people talking about like where do we go from here on out. But I think the United States should definitely invest more in Puerto Rico, and even in like some South American and Latin American countries, because that would solve, for example, the border crisis right now that's going on, like in Texas, and like the whole like Trump's whole Build a Wall campaign. That wouldn't exist if those countries were politically stable and safe. The problem is you have a lot of citizens that are like escaping persecution and if you're I always say that if you're like generally most of these people that are going over the border illegally are doing it because they almost feel like it's necessary for their survival. So it's like I feel like the US government investing in its regional like neighbors is going to go a long way for them, especially now with China as a rising power.
Oh, definitely. But one of the biggest issues the United States has is lack of confidence, going back to what we said,
right,
of corruption. So if they want to invest, they start sending funding to X programs. I don't know how they're going to use the money to move the economy, but they just don't trust the end side of where that money is going.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the big issues. For example, like we've talked about in Puerto Rico, that's one of the biggest issues. Like, to touch on something we said first, right now Trump is not approving the FEMA aid money to Puerto Rico due to the lack of confidence on management of the money. And that happens in Puerto Rico, and that's happening in a lot of Latin American countries, which is corruption is the biggest key. You can see it in Brazil. You can see it in Brazil. You can see it in Peru. Like presidents being indicted due to corruption. That's a big factor, and it's sad.
Oh yeah,
it's very it's something that happens so much in Latin America. It's absurd.
I guess going forward, the question is how do we solve that? And I guess we could even, like I mentioned earlier, because we're coming down to the last 3 minutes of the show, but we could definitely have an episode to talk about kind of potential, like how do we, like, I mean, and it would be cool too, because I'm starting to have professors on the show. So it'd be cool if we could bring like maybe like a foreign policy professor to tell us a little bit more about what are some of the potential solutions. I kind of want to get into that, but I
know a good professor for that.
Okay, good. Okay, thanks. I appreciate that.
He's from Argentina. So
okay, cool. Yeah. So yeah, but like it's definitely like that's definitely a big contributing factor, and you almost can't blame them, especially because at least like once again taking it back to Puerto Rico, since we're coming down to the end of the time here, we had a lot of like faulty logistics during like Hurricane Maria, like the aftermath. Even right next to where Marcelo lives, there's this big lot with still to this day a bunch of like water bottles that were not given out, and they're all spoiled and they're just sitting there because of a lack of logistics and because of like government corruption. So it's sad to see that like people are really being affected by all this stuff, and that kind of, in a way, the U.S., we're giving them reasons to not trust us.
That's the problem. Absolutely the problem.
So I feel like, I don't know, it's kind of uncertain, like where all this is going to go. It'd be cool to come back and do kind of like an episode. I mean, I guess us three, we could keep talking about this forever.
Yeah.
It'd be cool if we could have that professor come in. A lot of the stuff we're saying, too, I feel like might be controversial for American listeners just because they don't really have, I mean, no offense, but I feel like we as Puerto Ricans have a third-party point of view on the United States because we are U.S. citizens, but we are able to more clearly see how it interacts with other people, because even though we're U.S. citizens, we're not exactly treated like it all the time. So, yeah, this is like the last sorry for not like letting you guys talk. I know it's like the last
You're
thing,
good, don't
but I
worry.
just kind of wanted to close it out because I normally just say, like it's over, and I kind of want to have a little leeway. But yeah, so we'll talk about coming back. I want to
Just like we'll keep you updated with the GoFundMe. I'll send you the link so you can sell it. You can show it to your viewers, and yeah, we'll appreciate any help you guys can give on the funding. We'll appreciate it from the bottom of our hearts.
yeah, guys. So I'll be putting that link in the description so you guys could like see that whole stuff. This has been The Way with Maps. We'll probably be back for another episode. We love talking about this because it's very, very relevant to us and where we're from. But thank you for listening.